Good evening, I'm Vanessa Clark. Welcome to the Botanic Gardens for tonight's conversation with Denver's final two mayoral candidates, Mike Johnston and Kelly Brough. I'll be your host this evening alongside my colleague, Tom Brainerd. I lead marketing and development at PBS 12. I'm a former journalist, and most recently I worked at Volunteers of America, Colorado, which is one of Denver's largest homeless service providers.
And I'm Tom Brainerd, head of content at PBS 12. My background is in filmmaking. It sheds light on the human experience. We have a lot to cover tonight, but before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge why we're here. There are people in Denver who need a helping hand tonight. We are here because we want to find a way to be that help. There will be plenty of talk about numbers, statistics, politics, policy. But let's all keep in mind and in our hearts that people are at the center of tonight's conversation. Humans who need to be heard, our unhoused neighbors, and those at risk of being there.
Now we'll turn our attention to the stage. Welcome to our two candidates, Kelly Brough and Mike Johnston. Thank you both for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom and I are here to help introduce topics and to ask questions of the candidates. We're also joined this evening by an expert panel who will help ask follow-up questions. I'd like to introduce them now. Christina Carlson is the CEO of Urban Peak, a Denver-based nonprofit helping youth experiencing homelessness at all phases of their journey. Cuica Montoya is the program director of Colorado Village Collaborative's Safe Outdoor Spaces, which is an emergency shelter community with wraparound services. She's also formerly unhoused and bravely shared with us her story in our documentary. Rodney Milton Jr. is the executive director of the Urban Land Institute Colorado, whose mission is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in our Colorado communities. And finally, Stephen Shepard is the executive vice president of the Building Owners and Managers Association. This is a trade organization representing the commercial real estate industry.
Okay, together we all just experienced Decode Colorado Homelessness, a documentary produced by PBS 12 in partnership with Dope Mom Life Productions. That documentary and conversation tonight is part of PBS 12's ongoing commitment to give voice to all the stories that most impact us all. Denver voters identified homelessness as the top issue in this mayoral race. Mike Johnston and Kelly Brough, to start, I'd like briefly to hear from both of you. What parts of the film resonated? What did you learn? What did you find compelling? Mike, let's start with you.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for that incredibly moving story. And Cuica, thank you for sharing your story. I think what resonated with me was the truth that the stories told about how close every one of us is to this same experience. Being able to backtrack from where you might encounter someone when they're experiencing homelessness to what the steps were that got them there, and how at the same time they were living a life very like anyone else in our community, where you had a job, you had a family, you had access to services, and then how each one of those pieces can begin to fall apart, whether it is through addiction, whether it is through change in family circumstance, whether it is through lack of access to work or housing, and suddenly you find yourself in a place you never imagined without the supports you need to get yourself back. And also what overwhelmed me was how transformational the power of one individual is to help get you back on track in those moments where you feel unseen, unsupported, and unwelcome. And that was the really inspiring part for me.
Yeah, thank you. Kelly.
You know, when we were first coming on the stage, a few of us said one of the most powerful parts was being reminded of the power of the human spirit, and we saw it, and I believe in it too, and while it's so hard to watch, you're also reminded what we're capable of coming through. But I would add a few things, right? The film reminded me of we've created systems and structures that actually create what we face today, and create the inequities of who faces these challenges. And I thought it did a good job in a short amount of time of reminding us of our obligation to change those systems. I thought it did a great job of the responsibility we all have to as society to provide people a path back and to provide the supports needed. And I look forward to tonight's conversation. So thank you for setting this up.
Thank you both. Let's quickly go over the format for this evening before we dive in. Tom and I will prompt you each with a topic, and you'll have a minute to answer, and then our panel of experts will follow up with some additional questions, and we'll dive a bit deeper.
To ground everyone, throughout this conversation, you will hear us refer to people with lived experience, people experiencing homelessness, or the unhoused. All these phrases are meant to encompass the full range of people experiencing housing insecurity. As we saw in the documentary, 3 in 10 Coloradans are housing unstable. So it's not simply the visibly unhoused living in encampments, but also those who may have been living in an emergency shelter, living in their cars, staying in a friend's basement. It's our intention to be inclusive of all forms of homelessness and housing instability in this conversation. So let's dive in.
In Decode Colorado Homelessness, Britta Fisher says that, quote, "We have decided as a country that it's not okay for people to starve to death, but we have not decided that about housing." So to set the stage, our first question is, do you believe that housing is a fundamental human right? Do we have an obligation to ensure that all citizens are housed? And if so, what does that look like in your administration? Kelly, we'll start with you.
Yeah, in addition, I also appreciated when John Pervinsky reminded us that housing is part of healthcare as well. I also believe that is a basic human right, and we do have an obligation. And I think what we're reminded today is when we fail in that, what it looks like for all of us and for our cities. And so I think the path back is, I think we almost have to have a conversation about, we look at this issue sometimes today, and I think we want to believe that you made a choice, that you did something, that you could have controlled the outcome. I actually think people want to believe that because they want to believe it can't happen to them. And I think we have to change that conversation to remind everyone in our society of the risk and the challenges we face, how easy life can go wrong. And then I think it becomes an easier conversation to agree we have an obligation to house, provide health care, provide shelter for people in our community.
Mike?
Yes, I do believe housing is a human right. And I do believe that means it requires all the urgency with which you treat things that are human rights. And so for me, in my administration, that looks like how do we treat this as if it were a crisis, right? If you had someone that was in a building that was burning, you would figure out a way to get them out of it immediately and get them access to safety. On the nights when it drops to 10 degrees or 5 degrees or below zero, we see it as the urgent crisis that it is, knowing folks could literally freeze to death on the side of the street, and we try to emergency move into storage and the ability people to get access to shelter. We have to be able to think about that as an ongoing set of crises, which is that's true every day, whether or not it's below zero or not. So for me, it's about how do we put in place that housing incredibly quickly? How do we rally all of the resources in the city government? That means we have 11,000 employees. We have a comprehensive $4 billion budget. How do we treat this as the crisis it is, which means we're going to align all of those departments and agencies to work with real urgency to get people into safe, dignified, stable housing immediately. And that's something I agree with Britta, we can do.
Thank you. Thoughtful, both of you. Okay, let's talk about prevention. As we saw in the documentary, one of the biggest challenges is turning down that faucet, as Christina said, so to speak. The amount of people falling into homelessness is overwhelming the available resources. Mike first, and then Kelly, how will your administration offer people the dignity of remaining in their homes?
And one of the most important things we can do here is stop people that are facing eviction from getting pushed out of their homes and onto the streets, where we know the costs are much higher for all of us. I got to work a couple years ago on a project with a group of nonprofit leaders here called the Eviction Defense Project, which was focused on solving exactly this problem. What they saw is, yeah, you might have someone who's $300 behind on the rent, and a landlord is going to evict them for not paying that rent. What we know is the landlord's not going to get that $300. They're probably going to go a couple of months without getting a new rent. But more importantly, that person is going to be put out on the street, have no place to go, and have massive trauma and need a whole set of services that cost far more than keeping that person in their home in the first place. So what they did is created a nonprofit that helped pay that rent, lend that money to be able to have someone stay in the home, let them pay it back over time with no or low interest, but make sure you could actually protect someone's ability to stay housed, spend the money up front to keep them in that unit, and then be able to avoid the risk of people being made to be homeless and all the costs, human and financial, that come with it. So I think that is what I would focus on, is how do we expand these resources to prevent people from being evicted in the first place so they can stay in their homes and avoid ending up on the streets.
Thank you. Kelly.
Yeah, I don't think we heard a number in the documentary about the estimated percentage of people who are experiencing homelessness that are holding down jobs. Well, we know it's high. And I've heard as high as 40%, and somebody on the stage may have a better number for populations here living with us. But what strikes me is how quickly you stabilize, and other cities have discovered this. And there's a program that I found in Charlotte that I thought was particularly interesting, where we could maybe more successfully engage additional resources to assist with prevention, and that is the private sector. And in this program, it's a nonprofit where they basically underwrite the risk of rehousing someone who's been unhoused. And they'll pay the deposit, they'll pay the rent if you can't pay your rent. They'll even pay if you have to be evicted. But 90% of the people rehoused that way in existing vacant apartments renewed a lease for a second year, and it costs less than $1,000 per person per year. I think working across our system to look at how many people we could rehouse quickly with those kind of models and focus on prevention with the same strategies.
Thank you both. Now let's turn to our panel to go deeper on the topic of prevention. Christina, let's start with you.
So we've spent a lot of time together talking about the issues for people experiencing homelessness, and you've heard me often say, how do we do that upstream work, and what does that look like? And I think one of the pieces I'm really interested to hear from both of you is, as we think about prevention and those who are unstably housed, how are we getting services to them before they're falling into homelessness, and what does that look like? Because those services like case management and substance misuse treatment and all of those kinds of things we're doing for people as we're rehousing them, how can we think about doing that while they're housed? So Kelly, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I had the chance to meet with the head of the Department of Human Services in Washington, D.C., and they were trying to focus on exactly this issue about 5 years ago of could they start to form relationships with people who were receiving assistance in some programs from them, but they knew they were at great risk if one more thing went wrong. It was my family when I was a kid. And what they discovered is they'd start forming relationships with those services so that when you were coming in maybe to get your WIC or your food stamp benefits, you started meeting with people then about housing and additional supports, so you knew where to go before things got too dire or went too wrong. I think that's an interesting model. I also saw, we do this a little bit, but partnering with landlords to say, what if you called us first? So that if someone is struggling, we could not only assist with rent, but we could also identify what additional supports could we get to that family to help stabilize.
Yeah. Mike?
Thanks so much. I remember when I was a school principal and we would have kids who were in and out of experiences of homelessness, and we, as teachers, that you're often the person that can be the first responder to know when that situation is coming, and then we can proactively connect to resources and provide support, everything from transportation to a place to be housed. And I think we ought to be able to have the same kind of early notification system for adults. And so I really like the idea of saying we could have a partnership with landlords anywhere in the city that says if you have someone who you think is at risk of not making the rent or they're behind and you're considering taking action, you should let us know first. So we can try to figure out how do you provide services to that person up front. And I know, Christina, one thing that you care a lot about and I care a lot about is systems where you know we already have heavy predictive value they're going to end up being homeless. If you are a foster child who's 18 and is about to be emancipated, you're at one of the residential treatment centers that I've worked in or you have, we know there's already a pipeline of kids that are coming. The ability to both connect to those young people earlier and then get those services bridged longer, I think is going to make a massive difference in driving down our youth population that's experiencing homelessness. And that's something we know is happening right now, and we just haven't managed to solve it, and we need to.
Thank you.
So I want to talk about a little experience we've had just recently with the Safe Outdoor Space. So we've got about 20 plus people housed in a property that kind of is a little bit more lenient on backgrounds and things like that. So we got a lot of people housed there recently. And it's now been exposed that this landlord is operating substandard property. These folks have been without hot water. Their units have fallen into disrepair. And they're getting notices posted on their doors. So we had just got them in their apartments, and now they're in fear of becoming homeless again. So tell me, how would you hold landlords accountable? Oh, Kelly, sorry. I'm just not going to point to anybody and just
Yeah, I think the city passed provision, where we inspect in every property. I think we're at something like 13% of the landlords have registered in our city through this registration process, which just looks like it's such an ineffective, because my guess is the city is way behind because we probably don't have the staff to do all the inspections and the follow-up. I really would lean toward, in this case, where it's a speedy follow-up based on the complaint, where we prioritize when someone says we have an issue, so the city prioritizes getting in to hold them accountable for the conditions of the property and and issues that tenants are having and try to address them. Because my fear is what we're doing now is actually even worse, just to the example you've shared. And then I think there's probably some other things we can do for repeat offenders, the violations getting greater and greater. Historically, we would often call it a nuisance property if we got a serious amount of complaints. And there's other more financial burdens we could place on those landlords to require them to improve that property overall.
Mike?
Yeah, I see this as one of the fundamental equity issues that goes to how our friends and neighbors who need the most resources often end up in the placements that have the least resources, then are expected to do the most to make ends meet with sub-functional apartments or living situations. And so I think this is one where we have to be much more aggressive about making sure when there are complaints from folks who are trying to get access to dignified housing that's not providing that, particularly if the city or the state is helping provide financing for some of those units to support them, we ought to have much higher expectations about how they deliver services. We see the same thing in things like students of mine that went to college. Often the colleges that offer the most accessible tuition have the least amount of supports to be able to support students with academic support, mental health support, other housing needs that they might have. I think we want to reverse this to make sure we have the most support in those housing units that have people that need the most support at that time and hold those landlords the most accountable. So if you're going to serve our most vulnerable and those that we're working so hard to make successful, you ought to be able to meet a higher standard to make sure you meet their needs, and that means quick response when we have concerns and the ability to remediate that and improve them right away, which I think is more than fair to expect.
Thank you.
So going back to prevention, right? During the pandemic, lots of jurisdictions across the country deployed a fair amount of federal dollars in the form of rental assistance, right? You couple that with the eviction moratorium, and we were able to ensure thousands of families were not unhoused. To make that work, we created partnerships, and I say we as in the state, all these jurisdictions, an infrastructure to deploy it. My question is, and I'll go to Mike first, what do you think about that tool, rental assistance, and will it survive your administration if deployed, given the fact that those are federal dollars that funded that effort?
I think it's an important part of the equation. I got to spend a couple of years working on this problem around the development of Proposition 123, and we got to look at all stages of the housing continuum, which is what we realize is these things are all connected. Oftentimes when you're getting someone who's unhoused access to a transitional unit, you want to get them to permanent housing, but the challenge is those units aren't available, and then those units aren't available because folks that are making 60 or 70,000 are having to take the units for someone that's making 30 or 40,000. The whole continuum connects. And so as part of that, we did deploy state dollars that will be available for more ongoing rental assistance, because we know it's one of the most important ways to plug that gap. So I think we do have to be able to use the last bit of federal dollars that are there now to do some of the one-time costs, like building tiny homes, like standing up safe outdoor spaces, so we can get some of the capital costs built. But the ongoing year-to-year allocations of those are going to need to come from city and state dollars that would do things like services and wraparound support, housing funds, as well as rental assistance, because those are the best ways to keep people out of homelessness on the prevention side and make sure and help them get access to services on the transition side. And I think those are the places where our resources matter the most.
Kelly?
Yeah, I think, Rodney, this is fundamental, has to be part of our strategy to figure out how we, I'll call it, buy down the cost of renting in our region. But without the federal dollars, it means we've got to figure out how to do it. I've been interested as I continue to learn about master leasing, whether your housing authority or a nonprofit we might create could help us buy down some of that rent for our own residents. Issuing an RFP saying I want to take so many units for so many years, we start to lock in rent so it has a little more predictability for our residents, and they don't have to worry about that rent going up every 6 months and them struggling. And we buy a little time. The other thing I like about it, honestly, is because you're now a signer on that lease, we get the phone call before anybody's evicted. And we can jump in. And so I particularly like that. And so I would really explore how we could execute on a master lease kind of process.
Thanks. Let's move on to our next topic, which is the budget. In addition to overwhelmed resources, we're approaching a funding cliff, as Rodney mentioned, in terms of the federal COVID dollars drying up. Kelly, you've said that you'll end encampments in your first year, and Mike, you've said that you'll end homelessness in your first term. Both are very ambitious goals given the funding landscape. So here's the question, Mike first and then Kelly. How will your administration pay for these stated initiatives, and should we expect that you'll stop funding programs that are in existence today?
Thank you. Here's the way that I would approach this, and this is something I've laid out from the beginning, both what we hope to do, exactly how we plan to pay for it, and where those dollars come from. So I think people are entitled to know answers to that. And so for me, there are a couple components of this. One is, yes, we'll use our existing city budget, but what we know is the current need is one, as my proposal has been to do a lot more of the micro communities that we can build around the city, which can include both tiny home villages like the ones described tonight. They can include safe outdoor spaces. They can include hotel conversions like the ones that Colorado Coalition for the Homeless led. Those are access to units that are safe and dignified and stable. I would use the federal dollars that we have as one-time funds to be able to build out those capital development costs for those units. And then the ongoing costs to provide the wraparound services on those sites are what we would use from the Proposition 123 dollars. That's about $50 to $70 million a year that can be coming to Denver. About 10 million or so to 15 million of those can be used for the ongoing services for folks that are unhoused in these micro communities. And no, you would not see under my administration that we're going to cut resources. We're actually going to try to expand resources by using both those federal and state resources that will be available.
Kelly.
Yeah, not dissimilar to what Mike is describing. The social impact bond example that we did, though, I'm surprised we haven't repeated it in Denver because it's actually an example of how we end up saving money by housing people on all the other costs that we're spending today. And so I would absolutely start duplicating the social impact model that I felt like really proved itself out, and kudos to the team. We also know the state is more likely to give us those state dollars. I think there's $138 million there. If we partner with the region. And so I've met with mayors throughout the region, and 7 mayors in the metro area have said, we're in. We actually have to do this work together if we're going to make headway on it. And so there's 3 locations as well in the region. Hudson, Arapahoe County, and Fort Logan are 3 that would probably work very quickly to start to create a campus where we might be able to get people, but as a region. And we know in Denver today, many people who are experiencing homelessness are coming into our city because we offer the most supports and services for folks. And so I think we have to do this work together as well.
Thank you. Let's go back to our panel, and Kwika, please start.
Yeah, so I mean, it makes me happy to hear both of you guys talking about temporary programs for the right now. So Mike, there's a pathway for temporary tiny home communities to become more permanent, but they're not now. And our programs are temporary, so they have to move every 2 to 4 years, and the cost of that moving is exponential because we have to decommission the site, we have to, move the platforms, lay electricity again, have to move all the storage pods and the management trailers. So that's really costly every 2 to 4 years. So how do you plan to pay for these programs, the moves that go with the programs, and still keep your eye focused on the fundamental funding permanent solutions?
My first hope is to not have to keep moving them all the time. I'd want to work with City Council to allow to change those ordinances to make it possible for them to have to be permanent. I think the expansion to 4 years is solid, but no reason to continue adding that. It's not to say we won't be flexible if we find the right site where we have a tiny home village and that becomes a site where we can build permanent supportive housing, and we want to be able to do that. That could be a benefit, but we don't want to be moved out just to move to a new site because there's no good reason to move. And so my focus would be on finding sites where you can be more permanent, where we can build the infrastructure to develop those, and then be working in other parts of the city to be building up the transitional housing and the permanent supportive housing that people could be moving onto after that. I think those would be the top priorities for me. And as I mentioned, the first cost for those construction and the siting of those units would be from the federal dollars, and the ongoing maintenance and support and staffing of these sites, which when I visited your site the first time was so inspiring, that would be what we would pay with the state dollars. And so I think those have to be the 2 ongoing revenue sources so we don't cut into all the good work we're doing with the city dollars right now.
Thank you. Kelly, so how do you plan on scaling temporary managed community safe outdoor spaces to meet the unsheltered needs? And with those same, safe outdoor spaces and expanding them, and then the moves and, keeping our eye on the prize, how do you plan to pay for those?
Yeah, this piece I think is also using, when you look at the budget today, I think we have $254 million in the host budget this year. The estimate I think is about $100 million of that is probably one-time only ARPA money and $150 million ongoing. And so I would look at that $100 million of ARPA and figure out how much of that could we use, which we'd be diverting it to be able to use to create these temporary sites. But I also don't see them all in Denver. I see them shared throughout our region, and we have to do this together, and I can't emphasize that enough. I also think there's some costs we might be able to bring down, where we really invite partnership more with churches and even private property where people say, we think we have a site that could meet your needs. Maybe even inviting the private sector to assist us with the things like the running water and the tap lines that we need that are so expensive. And my hope is Denver Water might chip in a few more times on doing some of that. But I get the challenge, right, before us. I think for me, what drives me in this decision is the 173 people who died last year, the 269 who died the year before. For me, I'll measure our success by saving people's lives who today are experiencing homelessness in our city and get them to a safer location.
So yeah, thank you both again for being here tonight. So my question is going to take us a little bit of a different direction from the standpoint that both of you have participated in this Intercity Collaborative conversations, and BOMA and other businesses came together to figure out what could we do as a community to work on this challenge. So one of the things that we worked on really hard was House Bill 1153, the Pathways to Behavioral Health Care. So that was passed by both of the chambers, which we were very excited to see. And so that means that it's going to put forth a feasibility study to look at what can we create in Colorado that will create alternative pathway for those that are experiencing homelessness that typically end up incarcerated because of drugs and or they're stealing food because they need food to eat or those other things. And so giving them that pathway to help them along the line of getting their life back like we've seen can happen. So what do you think Denver's role in working through that as the biggest city obviously in the state? How would you work with the state at ensuring that we can create some kind of incredible program that would work and be successful?
Do you want me to go?
Kelly, yes, sorry.
Okay. I think this is a huge opportunity for the city. I think about the expertise the city brings from host to the Department of Human Services, but also the partnership with so many in the nonprofit sector to come together and really work with people who have or are experiencing homelessness and try to develop those pathways based on their experiences of what's the right way to build that system, what does it look like to actually serve people who understand from the lived experience what they need. And so I think how we could help is helping facilitate, bring everyone together, and ensure we're being true to listening to people and building the right system and structure so it actually works.
Mike, same question.
One of the things I thought was so powerful about the documentary was how it talked about how this crisis is the result of 3 failed overlapping systems at the same time. The way our mental health support system collapsed after we closed the ability for long-term inpatient mental health care, the way our addiction treatment support infrastructure collapsed, and the way our housing prices skyrocketed, and then we had people in the midst of all 3 of those crises. And I think the question is, how do we then find a way to rebuild those institutions around people that need that kind of support? And I think, Christine, I loved your phrase of it's not about what's wrong with you, it's a matter of what happened to you. And how do we get people in the places where you have communities? I think one of what was so powerful at Raven's story is her talking about the sense of community that exists in the site where she found you. And we know this is what works around micro-communities, is to be able to bring people from a community they might be living in when they're unhoused to a community that offers the safety and stability to feel like you can take a breath, you can know your stuff's taken care of, and now you can walk out and talk to someone who had the same lived experience or someone who can connect you to a mental health or an addiction-based resource, and you're much more likely to take that service when you feel that sense of comfort. We can rebuild that structure for the people that are able to access the care there, and then folks that have much more acute needs, we have to figure out how we get them access to more intense services, and I'm happy to come back to that when we have some more time. I got excited and forgot about the clock, I'm sorry about that.
So I'll just be the broken record that I've done with both of you before, is that with the CARES Act coming to an end, there is, that money is paying for a lot of what we're being able to currently do, and we're doing a lot of hard work and not meeting the needs. And so as that money dries up and as we see the need increasing, and we know that temporary solutions such as shelter and safe outdoor space and tiny homes are expensive, and permanent supportive housing is expensive and takes a long time. how are you going to pay for all of the things we need to do and like really pay for it? Where does that money come from, and how are you going to deploy it and keep it moving through us? So Mike, do you want to go first?
You bet. Yeah, we're excited to talk about this again. And
I know, just one more time.
I want to name that, acknowledge there are always going to be unforeseen costs and crises that come up. I know your systems are incredibly overwhelmed right now, even by the new addition of the migrant community that has arrived, and we couldn't have predicted that or budgeted for that. Now we're having to solve that challenge, which we should. But I think for me, what I've tried to carve out is what is the current universe we know of folks who are chronically unsheltered right now? What does it require to build the transitional capacity to support that? And at around 1,400 tiny homes or safe outdoor spaces, you're at about $40 million of one-time allocations that we would use from the current state funds that are still available. And then the ongoing service provision, we have a stream to be able to provide through the Proposition 123 funds. But I do know that you're right. There are going to be other unanticipated costs we haven't seen. For me, this is why this has been the singular most important issue of me running for mayor, is because this is the single most important issue the city faces. What gives me hope about that is the city is actually ready and inspired to be rallied to this cause, which means it's not about you all doing all the work on your own or about us funding it all on our own. It does have to be, how do we engage philanthropy? How do we engage the private sector? How do we engage other state and federal resources to say, we're going to take this on and we're all in, but we need everyone else to be all in too.
You know, when you run for office, people ask you questions like, can you tell me how you're going to solve world peace, Kelly? And do it in less than a minute.
That's the next question. That's fine.
You know, I look at this issue first for the urgency it is. The focus of funding and the year plan for me was about, can we get people to safer sites immediately to save lives? And then I would say to you, this is where we're going to have to work together. And one place I really agree with Mike is I think our city, our region, our community understands we have more work to do. We need significantly better strategies, more resources, and more help to do the work you've all been carrying on for so long. I think I could help pull that together as your mayor. But I also don't want to pretend that the complexity and the challenge before us is as simple as something I could put on my website. I understand how hard it is, but I wouldn't be running if I didn't think it was possible. Bless you. And I also feel, not only do I think it's possible to address these issues, but I know it is, because we have people who are with us who prove every single day the power of our human spirit and the power of our community when we do this work together. And I'm all in.
Thank you.
Let's move to future state, where we're looking at a full spectrum of permanent supporting housing solutions to move Denver out of this situation. Securing affordable housing is overwhelmingly the top priority of the unhoused, specifically with rents under $1,000 a month. What will you do to prioritize funding and development of deeply affordable housing? Kelly, please answer first.
Yeah, this is what I talked about a little earlier when we were talking with Rodney about how we can buy down rents using our housing authority or our and so master leasing, I absolutely think, is part of a strategy that could really work both to prevent homelessness, but also to help actual rents be more stable in our city. I think there's some other things we could do, though, too, and one of them is the city is incredibly inefficient in our permitting process today. And I know that's not really very sexy or fun to talk about, but it does cost us millions of dollars, whether we're trying to house people through the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, or we're trying to build an apartment in our city. And so there's two things I would do to make it more efficient so that we could make sure all those resources are saved and we can lower rent. One is I would first outsource and hire contractors to get through the backlog we have today, because it's 18 months to 2 years. And then the second thing is I would restructure the department so that instead of having multiple silos, we'd have one team that focuses on approving and getting people in the ground and up and running, and then we could actually qualify for that Prop 123 money and bring it home.
Mike?
Yeah, this is why I think it's so important to look at this as a continuum from folks who are experiencing homelessness all the way up to people who are trying to get into transitional housing to then stable, long-term affordable housing. And this is why so many people in this room worked together with us on Proposition 123, was to see that as a continuum and to fund it as a continuum and to provide not only affordability, but stability for families. And so what I would do is use those dollars to build, our goal would be over 8 years to do 25,000 units that are permanently affordable. What that means means is, John described that on the video, as that being the affordability gap right now in the city and county of Denver for, I think, 30% of area median income and below. What that would mean is that nobody pays more than 30% of whatever they make to rent. So if you are even a first-year teacher making $40,000 a year, that means you're not paying more than $1,000 a month for rent. And more importantly, your rent can't go up unless your income grows up. What happens now is we have families terrified at the end of every month that the rent's going to get raised and they can't find a way to pay for it. So if you're having someone who's just getting a first job or on a fixed income, moving out of the experience of homelessness, we want to make sure they're moving into a unit where they know what their rent is and they have stability with that rent over time, which is where I would focus all of our efforts.
We'll turn back to the panel. Rodney?
So in every city in the United States, there's an elephant in the community room. And that's NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. I'm curious to understand, how do you view this obstacle? Is it a big elephant, small? And what you intend to do to address it? And I'll start with you, Kelly.
Yeah, hey, thanks, man.
I know.
Because every viewer, I'm about to say, who were the problem. It's a big problem. I've been on the board for Habitat for Humanity for a number of years. I was the chair of the board last year for the organization, and this is a for-sale housing product, and we could hardly find a neighborhood where we could build that we didn't have full opposition to building. We have to build more densely. We have to build more affordability. We have to have a range of affordability, and we have to have it in every neighborhood of our city. And so I can see why the governor ran a bill in the state to say, hey, you're not quite getting there, Colorado. We're going to try to nudge you. I'm actually glad as mayor I get the chance to prove I think we're capable of doing this. But my experience is it requires leadership, your mayor, to show up, be at those hearings at city council, be in community talking about why this is so important, and I will do it.
For me, it is solvable, and for me, this is a challenge of coalition building. This is what it takes to be able to bring enough of a political force together from all backgrounds to push and get this through. And I knew the obstacles the governor was going to face because we faced those same challenges when we looked at Proposition 123, which is why we had to build a coalition of 260 individuals and organizations around the state to put their shoulders behind this, which meant groups as diverse as the Colorado Bankers Association all the way to the NAACP and the AFL-CIO, because what you needed is you are going to get that resistance, and you have to be able to have a much stronger base of folks that are private sector, that are nonprofit advocates, that are community leaders, that are civil rights organizations who all are saying, this is a fundamental civil rights, economic development, equity issue for all of our neighborhoods. If we can't get these units built, then the kindergarten teacher who teaches your kids cannot live in the city anymore. Then the environmentalists who are worried about climate means that teachers commuting 30 miles longer, which means more carbon impact. Then the business who wants to be able to recruit that employee to come and stay in Denver is going to lose them. Every single one of us stands to lose if we don't get this right. It's a matter of building that coalition around this so they know what the upsides can be if we do get it right.
So just a quick follow-up to make things a little more challenging. We're talking.
Good, because it was so easy so far.
We were so close to getting everything built. Yeah.
I just want to level. We're talking about power, right? We're talking about this differentiation of power that is in the hands of those who are here now, to deny and or exclude those who are on their way, who are on our streets and are here now, and to creating places for them. And so I understand the capacity to build coalitions, but the narrative associated with addressing that power from those who benefit from exclusion.
Yeah.
How do you address that? I'll go back to you, Kelly.
Yeah, well, Rodney, you described it even as people who are experiencing homelessness and housing. But the truth is, we're denying a range of housing, including an entry-level home ownership product. And for me, this is, I've even said as mayor, I'll build that product because we're not getting it built in our city, so we have a force so people can own again. And the reason I want to build it is because 41% of black families in Denver own a home and 73% of white families do. And we have an inequity. And so we have to do it. So this is for me as I show up in person, talking to that power about why we have to do it and that we're going to do it.
This is about power. I'm so glad you said that. And I think the challenge is there are a small number of people that exercise a lot of power right now because they're very organized. Mm-hmm. There are a large number of people that want a different outcome that are not organized. And so we lose this argument over and over because the not in my backyard folks are very vocal and very structured. For me, that's why it is about when you activate the voices of everyone who has something at stake in this not getting done, we are far greater than the number of folks that are saying no. The problem is we're also running busy lives. We're trying to do our own, we're trying to find a way to care for our kids, get access to housing, do 2 jobs. So we don't always have time to be activated in the way that the others can be. But that's why I think the coalitions matter so much, is if people all who care about this raise their voices together, it's a far more powerful force than the ones that are saying no.
So I'm going to bring this kind of back a little bit in that to the business side of the community. So community is a word that we've all been using because we understand that community is what everyone needs to feel the love, to feel the empowerment, to make better opportunities for themselves. I think one of the groups or the part of the community that's not always engaged is the business community. I feel like often it's an us versus them, and that's not the way it should be. And I don't know that that's really the way it is, even though the perception might be there. So one of the things, and I'm going to read this very carefully because I wanted to make sure I said this exactly the way that we intended. So, how do we find the balance between the humanity and the rights of people who are unhoused and the rights of the workers and business owners to have clean, safe, accessible conditions downtown? And I think that, and a great example of that I'm very proud of my BOMA members, we have worked with a couple of organizations and we created an enrichment day. We brought in some of their clients. Our members helped them pick out some clothes that they could interview in, help with resume building. We had a hairstylist on site. Some of the transformations were incredible. Headshots, LinkedIn profiles, and had lunch. And so it was a way for the business community to engage to help support the community at helping themselves get to those next steps that we want them to get to. How can you work with the business community to start helping include them in achieving the results? Because I think it's going to be much easier to do if we're engaged. So I'll start with you, Mike.
This is why I'm so optimistic about this, is because if you look at the fact that the voters of Denver have all said the single most important issue for the city to face is helping folks who are unhoused. There is agreement around that. Now, there may be different implications it has for different people. It might be for folks who are experiencing it right now, that is a real crisis. For folks who are supporting them, that is a real crisis. For folks who are running a small business and they're challenging with trying to navigate encampments outside of their home or outside of their business, they may have different approaches to the problem, but everyone is unified in wanting to get to a solution. So for me, that means there is actually a rare alignment where we're not at adverse interests, we have the same shared interests. The question is people are frustrated by trying to know what the solution is to get there. I think we saw tonight on the video, and we've seen from the providers in this room, what it's required to get from here to there. You're building them, and you're showing that example. If we can show the business community and other leaders who have that concern that this is a path that will both treat people with dignity, get them access to housing that offers stability, and help you be able to have an experience for your customers outside your door that they're attracted to and want to come to regularly, that is a shared interest. We just have to rally people around that vision and show them how we get from here to there.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because we kind of started this conversation by talking about judgment about someone who may be experiencing homelessness as if they made, just bad decisions or something, and us having to unlearn that people may assume that. The same happens here, right? The assumption is when you say, I want to help this person who's living outside of my building, unhoused, and I want to figure out how to provide assistance, the assumption is you're kind of a jerk because you don't care about them, you just want your building cleaned up. And I think we have to let go of that. The reality is we all want the same thing, that people are safe, housed, that they can find, frankly, a path to opportunity. I'm going to tie this to Rodney's question. His question was, how did you try to change people's minds when they said no, thank you? We actually brought businesses in to say, listen, the reason we need to build this housing that's affordable is my own employees need access to this housing. I have a self-interest in making sure if I'm going to be successful here, I need my team to be able to make a life here. That we share way more in the goal of what we're trying to accomplish. And I think if we can have leadership that causes us to put down our assumptions and our judgment, we can make progress together.
Thank you both.
I get to ask a really important question right now. So how do you invite people with lived experience to the decision-making table, and how do you amplify their voices and concerns in the development of your proposed solutions?
Yeah.
Kelly.
I can only tell you how I've tried to do it during my campaign as I try to figure out a path forward. It was the same thing I did with service providers of just meeting and trying to understand the issue. I went directly to encampments and talked with people. And you know, for me, this was really powerful for a couple of reasons. You were reminded of the range of issues and challenges. You were reminded of how self-aware and knowledgeable assumptions, right, that I think you make until you get there. And they really helped inform the urgency that I feel to get people to a safer location. I'd try to do the same thing, but frankly, I'd probably rely more on service providers and outreach workers to tell me how best can you do this in a meaningful way. Because the other thing I'm sensitive to is the burden we're placing on someone, an additional responsibility to help us build something at a time in their life when they're really trying to focus on rebuilding their own lives. And so I'd ask for help in trying to figure out how to do it right.
Mike?
For me, the first one is everyday conversations. It is finding every chance you can to have a conversation, whether it is with someone on the street, whether it was someone at a shelter, whether it is someone living in an encampment, whether it's someone in a tiny home. Because I find that if you've talked to one person who's experiencing homelessness, you've talked to one person who's experiencing homelessness, right? Every single person has a different story, a different set of needs, a different set of concerns. And so it's important to get the diversity of those ranges. And that's something I'll continue to do all the time as mayor if I'm elected. But the second is I do think you want to then institutionalize structures where people can provide ongoing feedback. So you do have people who can have permanent roles as advisors, the same way that providers do, the same way that business leaders do, the same way that philanthropy does. And so I would want to have an ongoing council of people who have lived experience, who can not only come and tell us what they want us to do, but can then give us feedback every month on how it's going. So, okay, you told us what you want us to do. We've tried to deploy this first strategy. How is it working? Well, bus ride's still too long to get access to methadone treatment, or still can't get access to services I need because they're not conveniently coming to the safe outdoor space where I'm at, or I wasn't able to bring my pets to this site or my partner to this site. I think that ongoing feedback has to be important, and that's why I would structure that as a permanent advisory group.
And as a follow-up, are you planning to have formerly unhoused people in key positions of power in your administration, Mike?
Yes. I think that's what I was talking about both how do you have people that have both lived experience and who can be key advisors, whether they're advisory, whether they're full-time. I think this is a critical part of the lived experience of Denver. I want a cabinet and a team that represents all of the lived experience of Denver, and this is an important part of that component, so I want to make sure that voice is in the room.
Yes, one of many experiences that will be in my administration, because I think the challenges we face today are such a range of, so someone who's experienced homelessness, but people who've struggled with addiction, struggled with mental health and lack of ability to get support, which I think is a distinction. I think the difference based on equity and race, you know, this has probably been a huge lesson in my own life. I married an Ojibwe man, which is an indigenous tribe in North America, and I learned early on the privilege I had as a white woman. And so for me, race and equity being central, and for that I mean someone who has experienced addiction and is a person of color, who has struggled with the criminal justice system and is a person of color, because I think that's different as well.
Okay. Thank you all for digging in and sharing your thoughts and solutions here. This is a tough topic. We know there's conflict and divisiveness, but perhaps after this evening we feel a little more hopeful. We'll see. Mike and Kelly, you've been at this for nearly 6 months, maybe a bit over now. Denverites have been asking what you're going to do about the issue of homelessness. Now it's your turn. What do you need from the people of Denver? This is your opportunity to be the coach rallying the team. Look into that camera, which is right over there, and tell us what you need. What help you need to make an impactful and tangible change in Denver? Mike, go ahead.
I think the most important thing that I'm going to need, and we're going to need as a city, is for us to see this as an opportunity and a challenge that we all share. I think that there are too many times where now we've gotten comfortable with the idea that you walk in downtown Denver and you see someone who is sleeping on the side of the road, or you see someone who may not be moving, or you see someone who may not be responsive, and we keep walking. And we've gotten accustomed to that being a regular part of our life, and it doesn't have to be. It shouldn't be. And if that were our own family member, our own daughter, our own son, we would never allow that to continue. We have to have that commitment as a city, which is not on our watch does this have to happen. No one should have to be homeless in Denver. We have a moral obligation to get people off of the street, into services, and help them get back the best life that we want. But that means we need you to feel like you have a part of this obligation. What are the things you can do to, yes, say I do want to advocate to have a micro community in my neighborhood. I do want to make sure I can support getting resources and services to them. I do want my business to come and help do a cleanup day or a support day. This is something, if all of the city rallied around, we could make Denver the first city that is able to meet Britta's goal of saying the number of folks that enter homelessness are the same number that come out every single month. And we'd be able to be the pride of the country as to saying, look what they did in Denver. That's a place where no one has to be homeless. We can do that if you'll commit to doing that with us.
Mike, thank you. Kelly.
What I would say to you as Denver residents is I think about what changed the course of my life. It was my ability to buy a home, if I'm honest, that my husband and I could buy a home, make a life here, and see our future. And today, that opportunity has been removed from so many people in our city. And not only can't you afford a home today, many of us who own a home would say, I can't even afford to live, and if I had to buy the one I'm in today, I couldn't do it. And you know that's true for you. And yet when you look around our city, you know people are struggling and they need help. And you could be in that situation if you would have come to Denver at a different time in your life. So I look around our city today, and I'm making a commitment that says I will make eye contact with every single person in it, that I see them, that I will never walk by someone who is not moving on our sidewalk or needs my help, but I will stop and make sure they get our help and our assistance, that together we can change the reality of people's lives in Denver. And it's not impossible, but it does require every single one of us to change our behavior and to say, when people live in this city, we're going to make sure that they find a path to their future, and that our commitment as their community is we are part of that path.
Thank you. Thank you to our candidates, our panelists, our audience here and at home. We appreciate you joining us. And on behalf of all of us here at PBS 12, good night.